Thank you so much for having me here today, and thank you, Rachel, Dr. Rachel, Professor Hyman. And as a professor, I'm here to remind you of lessons that you may have learned long ago. When we learn about the Industrial Revolution in school, we hear a lot about factories and steam engines, and maybe if you had a really particularly terrible teacher, the power loom. And we are taught that this technological innovation drives social change, explains how the world works, and has made it possible to work in the way that we do. Now, likewise, when we talk about today's economy, we focus on smartphones, artificial intelligence, apps. And here, too, the inexorable march of technology is thought to be responsible for disrupting traditional work, for phasing out the employee who works for a regular wage or a salary, and phasing in independent contractors, consultants, temps, and freelancers, of course, none of whom are at Google. This so-called gig economy. But this narrative is wrong. This narrative is wrong. The history of labor shows that technology does not usually drive social change. On the contrary, social change is driven by decisions about reorganizing people that reorganize our work. Only later does technology swoop in, accelerate, and consolidate those changes. This insight that it's not just technological determinism, that it's not just market determinism, is crucial for anyone who wants to understand the insecurity and other shortcomings of the gig economy, and more broadly, our economy today. For it reminds us that far from being the unavoidable consequence of progress, the nature of work is part of our social fabric, that progress, technological or otherwise, does not require insecurity. Consider the Industrial Revolution. Well before it took place in the 19th century, another revolution in work took place in the 18th century, which historians call the Industrious Revolution. Before this revolution, people worked where they lived, on a farm or in a shop. The manufacturing of textiles, for instance, relied on networks of independent farmers who spun and wove cloth. They worked on their own. They were not employees. In the Industrious Revolution, manufacturers gathered workers under one roof where the work could be divided and supervised. For the first time on a large scale, home life and work life were separated. And so this was a precondition for the Industrial Revolution. While factory technology would consolidate this development, the creation of factory technology was only possible because people were already in the factories, solving for this world. A power loom would have no purpose if people still worked in their houses. And the story continues today in what I call in the book the Second Industrious Revolution, in today's digital revolution, in the world and the economy that has come into being since the 1970s. It's often described as a second machine age, but it's more like a second industrious revolution. It's been underway for at least 40 years, encompassing the collapse since the 1970s of the relatively secure work of the post-war period. This is the post-industrialization. This is the rise of the service economy. And over these 4 decades, we've seen an increase in the use of day laborers, office temps, management consultants, contract assemblers, adjunct professors, Blackwater mercenaries, and every other kind of person filing IRS Form 1099. These jobs span the income ranks, but what they share in common is what all work increasingly seems to have in common since the 1970s: insecurity. This is possible because of the way in which work has become to be organized. Workers are no longer as closely bound to employers, for good and for bad. And all the tech of the gig economy, all the apps of your smartphone, is the result of that. For some, the rise of the gig economy represents liberation from the stifling bureaucratic world of corporate America. High-paid consultants, well-paid independent contractors. It is a return to the autonomy and independence of an economy before wage labor. No desk, no boss, every consultant, his or her own master. Yet for the majority of workers, this so-called freedom of the gig economy is just the freedom to be afraid. It is a severing of obligations between firms and employees. It is the collapse of protections that the people of the United States and our laws and our customs once fought hard to enshrine. Internet technologies have certainly intensified this development, even though most freelancers remain offline. But services like Uber and online freelance markets like TaskRabbit or Upwork were created to take advantage of an already independent workforce. They are not creating it. The technology is solving the business and consumer problems of an already insecure world of work. Uber is the symptom, not the cause. Uber is the waste product of the service economy. So today I would like to talk about just one small part of this book, which tells the story of how Americans created security in the years coming out of the Great Depression and World War II, and then suddenly, unexpectedly, dismantled it. This larger history is about how the corporation and the workplace have changed since the 1930s. It is a story of who counts and who doesn't count, who is included and who is excluded, how workplace stability, how a secure job stopped being something to be celebrated and instead became a problem to be solved by consultants. The story I'm telling today is part of the story of Silicon Valley, which I explore in depth in the book. This story here is about temp workers and undocumented migrants and legal migrants at the very bottom of the Silicon Valley world, the world that's often not discussed when we read those biographies of Steve Jobs or the Woz or these other so-called leaders of Silicon Valley. So today I'd like to tell you a different story of a place with which you're probably already familiar. So just as the agricultural economy was born between two great rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, so was the digital economy born between two great highways, 101 and 280. Or if you're from Southern California, the 111 and the 280. So connecting San Jose to San Francisco, these highways define the eastern and western borders of Silicon Valley, which had, until the 1950s, mostly been fruit trees. In the 1960s, as the electronics industry grew, these trees were cut down to make way for factories and offices. Now, today, Silicon Valley is mostly known for its apps. But in the 70s and 80s, it was still a place where products, first transistors and then whole chips, were made. And by the 1980s, electronics was the largest manufacturing industry in the United States. It was what economists call the leading sector, the place that was driving change, driving profits. And Silicon Valley's factories left Detroit's far behind. The 1980s. Detroit falters. San Jose thrives. Japan might have made better cars, but we made better computers. And if American manufacturing was to be successful, if America still had a claim on the future, if America was still seen as a leader in progress, it was in Silicon Valley. The electronics industry validated new ways to think about capitalism, since it, unlike any previous leading sector, depended on short-term, flexible workforces, depended on venture capital, depended on new lean ways of manufacturing, new kinds of supply chains, new kinds of subcontracted workforces, in a way that the Detroit never had. Unions were nowhere to be found. And the sporadic organizing campaigns of the 60s, 70s, and 80s all failed. Silicon Valley became the laboratory and the blueprint for a lean American capitalism. Apple never produced the good life for its line workers like General Motors did. And the story of flexibility in Silicon Valley is not just the insecurity of the workers on the bottom, but of course the success of workers at the top, of the venture capitalists that move from startup to startup, of software engineers who hop from project to project, of consultants, designing strategies and organizational structures to maximize profits and flexibility. And that's a story that we're more familiar with. But underneath that world were layers of formal and informal workers, of migrants. These migrants worked in large assembly factories, small Quonset huts, and even in their own kitchens, making the electronics that made those venture capitalists wealthy. And even though they are usually left out of the story of Silicon Valley, they are essential to its rise. From top to bottom, Silicon Valley defines a new universal model of business, even as its own industry, electronics, and then software, were unique. And it's interesting what's hidden by the stories we tell, as well as the graphs. This is a graph that everybody here knows. It's a graph of Moore's Law, which becomes, with the rise of electronics, the new time signature of capitalism. Twice as many transistors crammed on chips every 18 months. Look at it, it's so smooth, it's so logarithmic. This pace of miniaturization is astounding. It also has other consequences. It's impossible for firms to earn much money before they have to move on to the next kind of chip. And this punishing cycle made electronics a very different kind of industry than in, for instance, aerospace, where the same machines could be used for year after year on the same kinds of bodies, or even in cars. So work couldn't be as mechanized as in an earlier economy. It had to be more flexible. And this flexibility depended on people, especially cheap people, especially disposable workers. And so the flexibility of this production of Moore's Law just was not from engineering wizardry as much as it was from workers. So this is one part of one chapter in the book. And the first part of the chapter is about that world of consultants and business leaders, the story of Steve Jobs, the story of McKinsey remaking Silicon Valley. It's a story that you can see in this slide here, the story of the corporation from top to bottom, of consultants and temps and subcontracted workers, undocumented workers. But today, I want to talk about the people at the very bottom as this new kind of leading sector emerges. And if we think about the word temp, and this book is going to annoy lots of social scientists because they're like, oh, that just means office workers. I'm like, well, yeah. But really, it's a more expansive category of flexibility. And this kind of woman is probably the woman you imagine coming out of the post-war who may work as an office temp. A white woman, slender and beautiful. She's really a housewife, but really she goes sometimes to work. This is certainly the story that's told by people like Elmer Winter, who started Manpower Incorporated, that this is all discretionary. This kind of work is a choice for middle-class white women. But this is not the kind of woman I want you to think about as we are exploring this hidden history of Silicon Valley. I want you to think of faces like this. I want you to think of hands like this, women who need to work. And of course, the many people whose faces we don't have pictures of, who remained undocumented even as their work made Silicon Valley possible. Every year after 1965, the INS apprehended more what they called illegal aliens in industry and service than in agriculture. And in fact, these undocumented workers were foundational to the rise of Silicon Valley. Now, this is perhaps ironic that workers matter so much in Silicon Valley. Because, of course, if we imagine a place that would be automated, that would be this future kind of world, it would be electronics. Apple, for instance, and I can say this because I'm at Google, not Apple, which I understand what you guys are all excited about. Apple, that iconic Silicon Valley firm, bragged in 1984 that the factory for its new computer, something called the Macintosh, would be the most automated in the world. And everywhere they celebrated this. A machine that builds machines, it's amazing. It's highly automated. It's the future. It's robots. It's everything we imagine about the world to come. And yet Apple's factory, like all other electronics factories, was shockingly old-fashioned. It had some robots, on the line there. But to understand the electronics industry is very, very simple. Every time someone says robot, simply picture instead a migrant woman of color. Instead of self-aware robots, workers, nearly all women and mostly immigrant, hunched over tables with magnifying glasses, assembling parts. In the entire world in 1986, only 2 industries accounted, according to that left-wing propaganda instrument, McKinsey Quarterly, for 80% of installed robots in aerospace and automaking. And these workplaces these are all pictures of the first Macintosh plant. These workplaces were organized in accordance with new lean manufacturing principles. Historians often talk about the NUMMI factory, that collaboration between General Motors and Toyota, where today, of course, Tesla has its own factory. That was across the street from the first Macintosh plant in Fremont, California. They were both of the same moment, the same ideas of flexible production, of pushing things out into the supply chain. But, of course, with auto manufacturing, that supply chain was very visible. The supply chains of these places were instead, these electronics firms, were more hidden. Instead of robots, Silicon Valley relied upon a transient workforce. If they were white and native born, they were temps. If they weren't, then they were the laborers who worked by the day or by the piece. Tech firms outsourced labor to temp agencies, subcontracted sweatshops, and overseas factories eventually. So let's tell the story of this. Let's tell the story of John Senko, who in 1984 was an 18-year veteran of the INS, the forerunner of today's ICE. And it opens its first office in San Jose and begins to oversee the immigration issues in Silicon Valley. The INS believed that as much as 25% of the Silicon Valley workforce, about 200,000 people, was undocumented. Senko's task was simple, and yet impossible. Eliminate illegal labor in Silicon Valley. The office had only 4 investigators and was chronically under-resourced. Senko said, quote, "It's difficult to make people realize, because the nature of the industry, illegal aliens are working here. It's hard because high technology is a sophisticated industry, and it was easy to believe that no part of the production was unskilled." Behind graphs of this world, there were people who were not officially part of that workforce. Behind graphs of growth were workers like a woman named Fermina, whose name actually wasn't Fermina. It's a fake name I used in the book, whose names aren't as actually well known as IBM PC or Apple II. In 1982, Fermina had worked at an electronics assembly plant in Tijuana, where she had earned 65 cents an hour, quote, soldering gold filaments to nodes neatly marked on printed circuits for about 3 years. She peered hour after hour through her microscope, bonding semiconductors. Then the peso destabilized, and Fermina crossed the border to stay with relatives and look for work. Looking in the newspaper, she called a number where she could even inquire about jobs she had once left behind. She could even do it in Spanish. She felt very welcomed in her new country. And she found her own job bonding semiconductors. But this time, it was in an assembly plant that made parts for personal computers. Instead of 65 cents an hour, she now got $5. In the plant, hundreds of Mexicans worked alongside Fermina, many of them undocumented, just like her. For Fermina, it was a great-paying job, and for the firm, it was a great-paying, very cheap employee. For Fermina and people like her, it enabled great profits. In 1983, this factory was the 4th largest supplier of personal computers in the United States, with sales of $75 million and profits of $13 million. So that sounds good. It seems like a win-win situation. But you see, her life was, in fact, quite insecure. Because when the INS raid came through in November of 1984, Fermina hid in a supply closet, terrified. Fermina escaped, but 50 of her co-workers, nearly all Mexican women, were put in vans for deportation. Quote, I came to this country to work hard, but now I live torn between duty and shame. Firmina was not alone. Other high-profile INS raids found firms that employed on average about half of their assembly workforces illegally. Scholars estimate that about 100,000 Hispanic women, largely undocumented, worked in electronics just in Southern California. At the other end, consider the life of the Temp, Dennis Hayes, a world, just recently the Ampex sign was taken down, and I, for one, was very surprised to not hear this history told about the history of that iconic Silicon Valley firm. But in the story of Dennis Hayes, we can see the story of the interconnection between the white native-born workforce and this other hidden world of subcontracting. Dennis Hayes had dropped out of his PhD program in sociology, and he came to California to start temping in 1980. And he may have hated temping, but he noticed that he didn't have the worst job in the valley. Hayes noticed that this futuristic economy rested on a very old idea: give the dirty, dangerous work to people who had no alternative. Hayes temped at Ampex, which was then a leading audio electronics firm. And he worked on the floor of the assembly room, but he didn't put anything together. In that room was, like most assembly rooms in Silicon Valley, nearly all women, mostly women of color. And they put the parts together there with tools that were ancient, much older than transistors, much older than screwdrivers, even older than the axe. They used their fingernails. These women would grow 2 or 3 strategically long fingernails on each hand so they could move the components onto the circuit boards. Ampex was not unique. This all came through this world of work, dependent on fingernails and not automation. Now, what did Dennis Hayes do there if he did not actually put things together? Well, his job was to deliver and pick up components from subcontractors, the metal shops. High-end audio was made possible by low-end subcontracting. And in this regard, it was not just about finding cheap worker or cheap suppliers or vendors, but subcontracting out toxic work to places and people that were not part of OSHA regulations. So Hayes would drive to a dirt floor Quonset hut in Santa Clara, inside of which were Hispanic workers in rubber boots. When I go like this, it means I'm quoting because I'm a historian. Okay. In rubber boots, gloves, and apron, and without respiratory masks. The front and back doors of these Quonset huts were open. Some passively turning fans were in the ceiling, but otherwise there was no ventilation. The workers moved around quickly, stoking fires beneath vats of chemicals. Fires, vats, boiling chemicals, climbing up and down the jerry-built platforms which gave access to the vats. Some of the vats boiled, others, untouched by the fires, yielded the smoke of the chemical reaction. He was there to drop off chassis panels, nuts, and screws made in the Ampex's factory, and these subcontracted workers dipped the unfinished alloys in their vats. Hayes was only there for minutes at a time, but he wrote that the foul metallic odors made me want to hold my breath. Hayes never spoke to the workers there, only to the boss, who spoke to him in English while commanding the workers in Spanish. So the point of this system of production was not just to find cheaper, but to avoid legal action. This is tort liable work, outsourced to a network of employees to act as intermediaries. No official employee of Ampex delivered or picked up the panels, nuts, and screws. So no official employee of Ampex could ever really know the conditions under which this chemistry took place. If there was a legal problem with one of these vat-filled Quonset huts, it would have been easy to disappear into just another anonymous Quonset hut. And so the clean rooms of high technology are built atop a foundation of very dirty, very toxic Quonset huts. And of course, today, Santa Clara County has more EPA Superfund sites than any other county in the United States. At the very bottom of this system of electronics manufacture was not the small factory or the Quonset hut, but kitchens. Investigators found that somewhere between 10 and 30% of electronics firms subcontracted to what they called, quote, home workers. Like garment workers taking in sewing in the 1880s, electronics workers could assemble parts in their kitchens. A mother and her children gathered around a kitchen table, assembling components for 7 cents a piece. These little shops put together the boards and that went to the big companies. A California labor inspector turned a blind eye, saying, quote, a Mexican or Vietnamese can take home 1,000 coils for wiring one evening and put every close neighbor and family member to work and return the next day to the plant. It's not even worth our time trying to wipe it out. When there are people eager to work for pennies, you can expect that kind of thing to happen. End quote. It was their fault for being eager to work for pennies. While the image of the Silicon Valley was futuristic, its methods were more that of 19th century tenements. These home workers offered firms a cheap labor force, but the real appeal was, of course, flexibility. Chip processing fluctuated. Like cars, computer demand varied through the year, both for consumers, holidays, the new school year, and for changes in technology. The new cycle of chips, the tick-tock, as we call it today. And as demand went up and down, these firms had no obligation to the home workers, so these kitchens and Quonset huts would open and close as needed. Now, the exact number, how many firms, how many chips, is hard to point down exactly because itself was a subterfuge. Behind the big expensive plants were vast networks of other workers. Tellingly, more firms in the early 1980s at least, in various business surveys, subcontracted to exactly these kinds of home workers than offshore plants. Anyhow, what did the INS do about this? This is, as you imagine, there's not many pictures, but this is a picture of a binder, volume 8, entitled Illegal Aliens, from the INS library, just to give you a sense of what that world looks like. The INS encouraged the large companies to cooperate by offering them lenience for giving up their, quote, illegal aliens. At Circuit Assembly Corporation in San Jose, the INS asked for names of its non-citizen, non-documented employees. Of the 250 names, the company thought that, quote, 20 or 30 of them could be using forged papers. The actual number was 187. 187 out of 250. And the company, because it cooperated, received no penalties, no sanctions, and according to Senko, simply replaced those 187 with other workers, while those workers themselves deported. When Senko came to San Jose in 1984, he raided not just workplaces, but neighborhoods. In Menlo Park, just near Stanford, INS agents blocked the streets, removing Hispanic males from cars and from homes, checking them for proof of citizenship. In Santa Cruz, the INS went door to door checking citizenship. Senko and the INS agents believed they did not need warrants to name names ahead of time. Now, of course, local governments pushed back. The San Jose government pushed back against the INS in the name of defending, quote, Chicano citizens against harassment, passing a resolution against this, quote, unwarranted disruption of the business community. In December 1985, San Francisco declares itself a sanctuary city and directs its police and officials not to assist the INS in finding law-abiding but undocumented migrants. So what happens then? Does all this end? No. The INS enforcement becomes more selective, which actually enables Silicon Valley corporations to have even more power over their undocumented workforce. Businesses could selectively check green cards against an INS database. If workers began to organize or push back in any way against their bosses, they could be deported. The spokesperson for the International Association of Machinists explained that when everyone tried to organize, the company threatened to have anyone in the union deported. And what about John Senko? Let's not forget about his travails, his troubles as an INS agent here in San Jose. Well, for him, it was the worst 3 years of his life. He came to believe if he was actually successful in deporting undocumented workers from Silicon Valley, we'd have a revolution. He preferred, he said, businesses to cooperate rather than to have them raided. But that missed the point. The low cost of the undocumented, as well as their willingness, their need to work in illegal conditions, in toxic situations, made them too valuable, too necessary to the Silicon Valley economy. This economy, former INS head told a newspaper around that time, was built on the assumption and reality of a heavy influx of illegal labor. This former head of the INS was not just referring to the electronics industry, but the entire economy of the American West. This new American economy that was looked to by the rest of America as the future, as the most influential, as the most successful, was an economy that was built on the backs of people who had few rights, built on the backs of those excluded, built on the backs of those who were so hard-pressed they put their children to work in their own kitchens. By the end of the 1980s, these kinds of operations left the Bay Area, leaving behind the people who had made this new accumulation of wealth possible, and of course, the country's largest Superfund sites. This is a picture of two people that trained their own replacements in Singapore before Apple moved overseas. Look how happy they are. They're so proud. Now, why am I telling you this story? I'm telling you a story of the 1980s, which at this point is a long time ago. And I'm not telling you the story of the people who are above this, the world of consultants and temps and all those independent contractors. These people are important too to this story. But I'm telling you this story today, this history, because it's similar to how we are talking about the future now. Just as Apple talked about a world of automation and delivered a world of exploitation, so too we hear the same kind of language obscuring a certain kind of reality today. The language of robots and AI still do this cultural and linguistic work of erasing the present-day workforce, both visible and invisible. These workers are transitionary. These workers are disposable. The low-paid contingent workers of Silicon Valley do not count because someday they will be replaced by an AI, or so we hear. It's not a coincidence that these transitional workers look nothing like the engineers that are the face of Silicon Valley. The plight of Uber drivers doesn't really matter, as its CEO tells us, and I'm pretty sure I'm mispronouncing it when I call him Travis Kalanick. Because of source, someday narrow machine learning AI will take it over. These people are a transition to a better world to come, and it doesn't matter how they suffer. But yet somehow, this future never comes to them. This ever-receding future seems to legitimate a very real, very unequal, seemingly unending present. So as we think about the future, oh, there we are, the rotten apple. As we think about the future, we have to ask again and again the same question. Who counts? Who deserves, if not guaranteed work, at least secure lives? Who matters? We must, as we think about this, also not forget that even for those post-war white men, men who got pensions and defined benefits, men who had the good paychecks, working on the assembly line or in a mine or even in an office in a factory was dehumanizing, sometimes backbreaking, but most often soul-breaking work. Whatever the wages and benefits, humans should not do the work of robots. So it's not simply that we should give up on automation. We should give up on robotics. We should give up on the future. But that we should think about the future cognizantly of how the past has used the future to erase the present. We can't turn back the clock to a world that was never as great as we imagined it was, to an America that was never as wonderful as we often hear it was. But progress does not require insecurity. Just as the post-war period managed to make industrialization benefit some industrial workers, to give some people this level of security, we need to create new norms, institutions, and policies to make digitization benefit everyone today. It's important as we make choices going into this world, whether conservative or liberal, that this world of independent work, this world of automation is coming, and that we need to remember that we have choices about how it will play out. That the distribution of wealth and productivity is not just an economic reality, but a political choice. So just as the industrial economy offered inequality and growth for 100 years before it produced the, quote, good life, so too will the digital economy. And we need to understand that this flexible workforce can, depending on the choices that we make, be the liberation from wage work that Americans have so long yearned for, or to be immiserated, to be damned to insecure life in an unequal society. And as we choose this world before us, we should not make the mistakes of the past, creating a more inclusive capitalism that accounts for everybody. Insecurity is not the inevitable cost, nor does progress require treating people like machines. Only by understanding that fact can we make capitalism work for us, not work us over. Thank you so much. Happy to be here today.
So yeah. It sounds like one of the primary reasons that undocumented workers were able to be exploited was because they were undocumented. How do you feel about open borders?
Yeah, I'm actually very much, so in the book I take account of all these different approaches. So one of the approaches people often say is, well, we should have sanctions, right, against employers. If you hire someone who's undocumented, we should sanction the employer. And in fact, in 1970, the state of California under Governor Ronald Reagan, former movie actor, passes a law to do this. And in fact, that following month after it was passed, the department responsible for it lost 79 out of 80 employees, leaving one person to enforce the law in the whole state. That law was actually never enforced ever. And again, there is an appeal to this idea that we can simply solve this problem of excluding and exploiting people by sanctioning employers. And it's never happened ever. There's too much pressure, on the other hand, for large corporations. So I think we do need to have open borders. We need to make sure, we need to make sure that people who are here are protected under the same kinds of laws and rights as people who are citizens of this country. Did I bum everybody out?
So I have a question.
Yeah.
So if the robots are going to make everything, what about basic income for everybody else so that, if I own the robot, I'll send it to work and I can relax?
Sure. This is often like, what about the basic income? So in the future, people will be worthless. In the future, all that will matter will be programmers and other technologists and engineers. And I talk about, this is often something I hear, like, oh, I'm the only one that's worthwhile. Well, I think that there are actually lots of things that people do that are worthwhile besides computer programming. And I think as we look to the future, as I think actually you guys all agree, as we look to the future, we should be thinking about how we can use technology to liberate us, to do work that is more human. Just as the mechanical thresher meant that we didn't have to all go in and reap the harvest, we can use automation to liberate us from tedium, from paperwork. And this is something we have to take account of as we think about the future, how work can become more human. We can become caring and curious and creative together. And the basic income is certainly one approach to do this. It's certainly a very liberal approach. It's an approach that has a lot of appeal, but it also is in contrast to a lot of the political values that Americans have. So another approach, a more conservative approach, would simply be do something that is modeled in the 401k, where as you move from job to job, you are able to take your retirement and healthcare and other kinds of benefits with you. I think what's important here is not the specific policy that we use to address this new independent workforce or even automation. It's that we need to make sure that we're not just nostalgic for the past and try to return to this old world, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. I also think that as we think about solutions to this, we need to acknowledge that the automation has never fully replaced the need for people, and that people will always be of value.
One sense I got from this talk was that automation, what you said, Apple kept claiming that they were going to do in fully automated factories, but it seems like that will not happen, that the temp work will just change hands, in this case, from the Silicon Valley to Singapore, and then from Singapore maybe to somewhere else. Is that a conclusion that you have come to, or do you think that we will eventually reach a point that automation does actually happen?
Well, automation has certainly already happened in the sense of increasing productivity, right? I mean, if you think about things like agriculture, the best analog is not, in the AI world of tomorrow, is not industry, it's agriculture. So that less than 2% of the workforce now feeds all the rest of us. And those people are able to do other kinds of things. The thing I think the rhetorical value, the rhetorical consequent of automation and robotics is imagining a future in which the present is erased, right? And that some people are left out of this new economy or the contemporary economy and treated badly. And that's the kind of thing that I'm trying to push back against, I think, in this history.
Yeah, and it just seems like when one person to erase has been erased, they'll just move on to the next one, is what I mean.
Yeah, it's a problem.
It just seems like it's going to keep going that way, that we're never going to actually get that perfect automation. We'll just find another group.
Well, that would be unfortunate. I'd like to think that we'd be able to make progress in not just playing whack-a-mole, where we're the moles that get whacked. All around the world because of automation. I do think automation, there's a lot of ways in which narrow AI has a lot of opportunities here, as I'm sure all of you can talk to me more about than I can talk to you about. And machine learning is exciting, but I do think it's going to be, relatively constrained and not sort of take over every aspect of life.
Of course, I don't think it's going to take over every aspect right now. I'm just probably badly extrapolating from the story shown in this talk so far.
Well, I think that's also a good point. So the question is, fundamentally, can things get better? Is that what you're saying? And I think one of the things that we can learn from the history of capitalism is that it can be more inclusive. I think things that in our economy is more inclusive than it was 40 years ago. It's certainly more inclusive than it was 400 years ago. And we can change the foundations of capitalism as we want. So in 1850, 55% of the GDP of America was based on enslaved people or the products they produced. And yet 15 years later, it's not. Yeah. And so we can re-more the foundation. For me, this is a tremendous opportunity to think about, well, how do we remake capitalism so that it works for more people? And I think that's something we need to consider as whether we want automation to make few people rich or whether we want it to or to liberate the rest of us.
Yeah, and I guess my point is not that things don't get better. It's more how long can this game keep being played for? Because so far, at least for now, it seems like that's what we're doing. We're just going to keep playing this game.
Well, I think we have a choice about playing the game, and I think that's a great point, though. It's a great point.
So you mentioned that automation cannot completely replace people. So I'm curious to hear your perspective about a scenario where automation does replace people entirely. Let's say if you have machines that is as smart and as intelligent and creative as humans. At that point, from your perspective, what do you think?
What would happen? So in that scenario?
How would that change society as we know it?
I think people are valuable not just because they're smart, right? So people are valuable insofar as they can care for one another, insofar as they can create for one another. So if you're just talking about a future where you're like a Westworld general AI scenario, where the robots are as smart as us?
Yeah, so imagine
Terminator?
AI scenario. I mean, which may not be that close as we think, but let's say if that happens from
Yeah.
perspective. I'm just curious.
Yeah, no, I mean, I would be, it would fall, like most science fiction, it would fall into the 100% dystopian and scary, or 100% utopian and kind of boring, right? We would just sit around just eating ice cream all day, which is boring but kind of wonderful. My suspicion is it's going to be more like the mechanical thresher, in that technologies will accelerate productivity, they will displace segments of the workforce, and we'll have to figure out what to do with the rest of the people. So coming out of this agricultural revolution, we had to really tool up the way we educated our people, so that this is the moment when people become literate, when they begin to go to school in the 1920s and 30s, and that kind of industrial education worked well for an industrial age, and we found other uses for them. So I think the trick is nowadays our educational system is not built to teach people how to learn. It's built to teach them to obey. And we need to have an educational system that does encourage curiosity and creativity for the new kind of economy to come. If this happens, I don't think history will matter at all, because that kind of world of general AI will be just something that I probably imagine you or I can't fully think about.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I know the focus of your talk was primarily on the past and how we should use it to frame the way that we think about the present and how we want to mold the future. It was more focused on generalities rather than specific public policy. You mentioned corporate sanctions as an idea that we shouldn't try, but surely there must be public policies that you think we should be advocating for, either internally as members of a corporation or as citizens who vote in order to shape the future that would be more pleasant. What are some of those policies? Some
of those policies are laid out in this delightful book available for sale in the back of the room.
I've already bought mine. Anyone else should do the same?
They make wonderful doorstops or kindling, depending on your proclivities. So I think that there are lots of policies that one can go. In the book, I lay out both very conservative ones, so you can talk about it with your Republican friends. You can also talk about it with your liberal friends. I think what's important is that we choose to recognize what's happening. That this is that half of people under 34 are working in this freelance economy, right? In this gig economy, in this temp economy, and that this reality is not being talked about, right? We are treating it as this is not real work, this is not real job. Well, this is where people are, right? And I think that this book is trying to put that in a longer perspective. So people talk about it as if it's Uber and the apps and the phones and stuff like that. Well, this has been going on for a long time. And we need to understand that it's choices we're making about, big corporations, how they treat the people who work for them in a temporary fashion. Large tech firms often have numbers of contractors, and other kinds of subcontractors. What is the relationship between them and the, quote, real employees? How do we even value companies like that? If we look at them, one of the reasons we value companies so much is how low their headcount is. The fewer employees, the better. So how do we think about valuation if they want to embed not just money, but our values? So this is an important question.
So there's no one specific public policy you want to get up on your soapbox and advocate for more than
there's no silver bullet. There's no let's get basic income and then everything will be okay. Or let's put employer sanctions in place and then everything will be okay, right? If there were a simple answer, we already would have done it. And I think what we need to do is have a larger, more expansive conversation that talks about the big question of how do we create security in a world where work is more insecure. And maybe we decouple in many different possible ways, depending on our political consensus, how that security may not longer relate to the job, right? And split those things apart. So one of the things I think a lot about is how is the job like marriage, right? How is work like marriage? Right? Very few people these days are getting married, right? And yet we're still trying to rebuild our social system, our social norms, addressing this problem of what happens to children, that are born out of marriages, right? And this is the norm now. That's happening. We have to acknowledge that. I mean, we want those kids to grow up well. We want this to be the world that people are treated well in. Similarly for work. The norm, a few very sort of privileged people are allowed to have secure jobs. Like I have a lot of security. I'm a tenured professor at a school, right? So I am part of this old world. Yet 70% of professors are adjuncts. You know, they make $2,000 to $3,000 a course. Their lives are immiserating. And it's important that people like me say, that's not OK. Or how do we take this kind of flexibility and create security for them? And similarly, for those who are in positions where they have security in their lives, to speak for these other people that don't have as much security. And I think that's just being humane. That's a good question, though. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
My question is a little bit off topic, but you mentioned that like post-war, like the traditional industries, the workers will have like unions. But for us, like software engineers, I don't think we have a union or any kind of these things. Do you think because of like the nature of job, it's not necessary, or it's just a problem that we just ignore?
Do you want to have a union?
Software engineers?
Yeah.
I don't know. That's why I'm asking.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends. You need a union if you feel like you, I mean, for me, generally, it's like you need a union if you feel like you don't have agency in how you control your own work process and your own life, and you feel like you're being mistreated. I suspect you feel like you worked a lot at Google, but you're not mistreated exactly. You know, I think that's very different than if you're in a dead-end job where the boss kind of dictates to you and you feel like you have no control. Historically, that's only, so I would worry less about, I don't worry as much about software engineers, unless I know them and they're friends of mine, then I worry about them on a personal level. But as a class of workers, I'm not as worried about them as I am about janitors or Grubhub delivery people, or retail workers. You know, in the coming years, the gentleman earlier was asking about automation. Like, I kind of don't believe in the world of general AI and Westworld and stuff like that, but I do think retail workers will all lose their jobs in the next 15 years. This is where most people work, and they're going to lose their employment. Now, software engineers, you guys have a lot to worry about too, right? I mean, there's a lot of contract work. You know, at Google, you're kind of like at, you know, the Cornell or the Harvard or whatever, or Dartmouth of sort of, you know, software. So you're not as worried. But, you know, a lot of people in software engineering have very tenuous, precarious jobs as software engineers. And there's a lot of things coming down the pipeline that seem like it could automate software engineering as well. But, you know, I think the trick is that software engineering, as you guys literally all, every single one of you knows better than I do, is not just coding, but being creative, right? Thinking analytically about algorithms. And I don't think a computer can do that as well as a human being, so.
Well, I'm not mostly worried about myself. It's,
yeah.
As you mentioned, there's like a lot of like contract coders or like freelancers, which in general are not protected by any kind of like unions or like laws, anything. So I was
when people are highly skilled and in demand, they don't need unions as much, right? I think that, you know, programmers, as long as they are part of, they deliver lots of value, they're high skilled, they're not totally interchangeable. Despite what I read in Quora, I don't think that programmers are interchangeable. And I think that, you know, there's a lot of opportunity for people to work remotely and be anywhere. One of the exciting things about this economy is that, you know, in the book I write how what's different about today is not AI. AI, narrow AI, is just another way in which tools become more productive. What's different is we may no longer need the corporation to access those tools. That you can sell globally, you can work globally, you can consume globally, and that the corporation might no longer be necessary in capitalism is a shocking transformation. So I think that that's what you guys should be thinking about. You know, how do we work in flexible teams, assembling production together? And so, do you need a union? I think that's only for you to decide. But I think unions are really necessary when people don't have power unless they work together. Thank you.